Welcome to the U.S. South Korea Allied Approach toward North Korea-Russia cooperation. My name is Arius Dare. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Korea Economic Institute of America. Today's event is the first in a series of panel discussions on the new presidential administration in South Korea. All of these are going to be collected in the forthcoming edition of our academic journal, Korea Policy. I encourage you to visit our website and follow us on social media to RSVP for those upcoming conversations. And the full edition of KP, or Korea Policy, will come out in early December, just in time for your holiday reading. We also have a really busy month here at KEI, programs touching on a wide range of U.S. Korea policy issues, so be sure to stay connected with us online. I also want to flag an exciting release tomorrow. This is a new KEI YouGov survey report that contains what I believe to be the absolute latest data on how the American public views the U.S.-Korea alliance and many of the topics we'll be discussing today. The short version of that is most Americans continue to see South Korea as a stalwart ally, and they oppose additional tariffs. That's it. You have to read the full report to get the rest. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Edward Howell, a lecturer in politics at Christ Church, University of Oxford. His research focuses on the international relations of East Asia, the politics of the Korean Peninsula, and North Korea's nuclear program and foreign policy. Edward is the author of North Korea and the Global Nuclear Order, When Bad Behavior Pays. He holds a double first-class degree in geography and a distinction in the MPhil in international relations, both from the University of Oxford. His DPhil research, also at Oxford and funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, examined North Korea's nuclear behavior. He served as an Emerging Leaders Fellow with South Korea's Ministry of Unification and as a Korea Foundation Next Generation Policy Fellow at Chatham House. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edward Howell. So I'm going to start this event with a question that I always wish people would ask me if they ever invited me to speak on a panel, which is, what's your paper about?
Thank you. Well, it's very, very good to be here in DC. It's a very interesting time in global politics, in local politics, and in the politics of East Asia. So thank you to Scott, thank you to Arius, and to Ellen for the invitation. So my paper is fundamentally making quite a simple argument, although hopefully not a simplistic argument. It's that actually, in my view, the relationship between Russia and North Korea has both deepened as a form of security partnership between the two states, but also widened, and particularly this year. Particularly this year, it's expanded beyond the domain of security. And so because of this widening and deepening, I think it's actually very important that we do not dismiss these ties as merely a marriage of convenience. Yes, these ties began in a transactional manner, cash for artillery exchange. But we must prepare ourselves for continued cooperation in some way, shape or form. That's my caveat. However and whenever the Ukraine war ends. I'll say a little bit just about these 2 points about deepening and widening. I think deepening, we've got the obvious signs. First it was artillery, then artillery plus missiles, then artillery plus missiles plus troops. 11,000 or so last fall, an additional 1,000 to 3,000 this year. We've seen Russia give North Korea crude oil, which has allowed Pyongyang to free up a lot of its financial resources to fund its nuclear and missile program. North Korea no longer needs to go through complex oil smuggling networks. And not only have we seen the supply of troops, particularly in the Kursk region, but in April this year we saw Russia and North Korea admit that these troops were there. Now, that's the deepening part, and I'm happy to say more about this, okay? Now, if you read the Comprehensive Security Partnership Treaty, Strategic Partnership Treaty, signed on the 19th of June last year, everyone focuses on Article 4, the Mutual Defence Clause, and rightly so. This is important, right? It's not the same as the 1961 Soviet Union-North Korea Treaty, and I think these comparisons are useful. But if you read Articles 9 and 10, it highlights how cooperation is not limited to the security domain. So when I talk about the widening of relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang particularly this year, we've seen what I call a multi-sectoral relationship. It's not just security, nor is it economy. It's tourism, it's culture, it's even AI. I'm going to outline just 3 events that for me highlighted this. There's obviously a danger, as we all know, being Korea watchers, of reading too much into this. But I think it's important that we situate this following the signing of the treaty. So at the end of May, we saw North Korea's Minister of State Security, Lee Chang-dae, make his first known and publicly announced overseas visit since 2011. He met Sergei Shoigu, but also earlier in the year, he met his Russian counterpart, Sergei Naryshkin. Okay, so that's sort of security, right? But then what else do we have? Well, July the 1st this year, the visit by the Russian culture minister with a delegation or a troupe of performers to Pyongyang. This is the infamous occasion where we saw Kim Jong-un visibly emotional, shedding tears in front of coffins of North Korean soldiers who had been killed in the Ukraine war. But 2 weeks after that, we saw a visit by the Russian Emergencies Ministry to North Korea. And the official reason was to assist North Korea in preparation for the rainy season. Now, how useful might this be? It's all very easy to dismiss this as just useless, but actually Russia could quite plausibly offer North Korea some useful cooperation in this regard. What happened in July last year? We all saw the pictures of Kim Jong-un on a boat looking not very happy amidst heightened floods and the evacuation of more than 40,000 people from the north of the country. So I've outlined just in brief a few of these very sort of this deepening and this widening. And I think crucial to this deepening and widening is how both sides refer to their relationship. After North Korea and Russia signed the treaty on the 19th of June last year, North Korea referred to the relationship as an alliance. Russia kept going with its wording of partnership. But this year, we've seen the Russian ambassador to North Korea, Alexander Matsegora, we've seen Sergei Lavrov, Sergei Shoigu use the word alliance to refer to its ties with North Korea. Now, is this a translation issue? Is this a slip of the tongue? I think that to say that would be slightly dismissive. Okay, there is a qualitative upgrading in this relationship. And the final point, I know this is quite a long answer, is to do with ideology. Now, Russia and North Korea, they don't have the same ideology. I think if Kim Il-sung were alive now and looking at North Korea, or if Lenin were alive now looking at North Korea, Lenin would say this is actually not Leninism sort of in its pure form. But I think for all the individual differences in ideology between Russia and North Korea, the ideological unity through the opposition to the US, its allies globally, and the US-led liberal international order is a glue that's holding these two countries together. And I know, I'll say more about this later on, also we can add China to the mix. We can even add Iran, perhaps.
So you've preempted my first 3 questions, which is great news. So we can really sort of get into, I think, the meat of your paper as a result. You know, you're talking about this widening across AI, across cultural coordination, across disaster management, et cetera, et cetera. This suggests to me that from a U.S.-Korea alliance perspective, this is not an ephemeral sort of constellation of factors between North Korea and Russia. This is actually a permanent status quo change that the U.S. and South Korea, as well as the U.S.'s other allies, are going to have to confront for a long time. So let's say the war ends either in an armistice or something else. We don't need to speculate on how exactly that might happen. What does Russia's support for Pyongyang look like afterwards? What does this, you called it an alliance, or you at least quoted North Korea and Russia calling it an alliance. What does the alliance look like, let's say, in 5 years if the Ukraine war ends?
Okay, so you mentioned this permanent status quo, and I think we should be a little cautious about saying this is a permanent shift. I think in the event of an end to the Ukraine war, the relationship will still be there, but it will qualitatively look quite different. I mean, we could argue that Putin might want troops, and he knows that North Korea is willing to provide them for whatever foreign endeavour he has. But I think, in general, if that is not the case, the relationship is going to look somewhat different. But this is not going to be, in my view, the same as 1991. It's very easy to say, well, Russia will just bin North Korea, I mean, to use an Americanism, put it in the garbage can, right? Akin to how it did in 1991. I can understand the interest-based calculations here. If Russia feels it doesn't need North Korea as much as it needs North Korea now, it may want to loosen the ties on this relationship. But the reason I don't think we're going to see a complete discarding is because it's as if now we've seen the Cold War relationship being upturned. During the Cold War, North Korea was very much dependent on the Soviet Union, trying to play off the Soviet Union and China. Now, Pyongyang is still, in my view, playing off Beijing and Moscow, but it's as if this dependency argument has gone the other way around. At Putin's time of isolation, only North Korea came to his assistance. So what might this look like in 5 years' time? Well, the treaty mentions a vast range of areas: food and energy security, climate change, science and technology, information technology. I've listed only a few here, and I think this highlights how this is not just about manpower for missile and military technology, even though this missile and military technology that Russia is likely to give North Korea is what we know the least about, and this is why it's concerning. I think in the future we're going to see cooperation in these broader areas. Now, the one area I haven't mentioned there is cyber. We know that North Korea is funding its nuclear program. Around about 50 to 60% of it is being funded by cyber warfare. Is Russia, which has been known to engage, as we all know, in large acts of cyber warfare, likely to provide advice to Pyongyang on this front? This is one possibility. Okay. The key question here, though, comes down to interests and costs. I don't believe that in 5 years' time Russia will supply North Korea with A+ grade technology, missile and military technology. This, to me, does not seem realistic, particularly if we look at Russia's own interests. But B+ grade technology to help North Korea develop re-entry technology to help North Korea in terms of reconnaissance satellite launches, I see that as more plausible. And the B+ technology is going to be better, in my view, than anything that North Korea has now. What about ideological support? Now, I don't want to predict what the UN Security Council will look like in 5 years' time. But one of the things that Russia has given North Korea is its unwavering support at the UN Security Council. The demise of the UN panel of experts in March last year, one key moment, that was one critical juncture. And I think this unwavering support in undermining security institutions is likely to continue. Now, there are a whole lot of factors that might change this relationship, but if we just look at this bilateral ties in terms of what each country gets, that's one thing. I must add, a lot of people will say, well, what will Russia get in return? This is all benefiting North Korea. Everything I've said thus far benefits North Korea. I mean, I call North Korea, in my recent book, a strategic delinquent. Bad behavior pays. But we know that Russia has a chronic labor shortage. And at the end of 2017, when the UN Security Council passed a resolution unanimously supported, including by Russia and China, to return North Korean workers overseas within 24 months of that resolution being passed in December, the two countries that did not do this were Russia and China. And now that Russia has a chronic labor shortage, it's willing to take more and more laborers from North Korea. I think this will also continue in the future. So both sides gain, but crucially, this is asymmetric. That's one big caveat here with all of these relations. They're asymmetric.
So in your paper, you question the idea that the Trump administration really has a handle on these themes that you identify and perhaps does not necessarily understand these big shifts that you're talking about. So how do you see that affecting alliance coordination on this new North Korea-Russia threat? What risks does the current administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific pose if the priorities diverge, if the focus is so much on, say, winning a trade war with China? What space or what risks does that then give or create for North Korea-Russia cooperation?
So at the moment, I think, at least in my view, the US administration's actual policies towards the Korean Peninsula are still quite unclear. Now, what is clear is this focus on deterring China, but I think, as you've rightly said, Arias, it's an economic focus. A lot of people say that Trump is a hawk on China, but this is really only coming out particularly in the economic domain. Now, the challenge this poses, all of this poses for the alliance, is that, number one, the North Korea threat is multi-pronged. It's not just vertical proliferation of nuclear weapons and missile systems, plus human rights violations. It's this cooperation between North Korea and Russia. Okay, so for the US and the ROK, the challenge of North Korea is only getting bigger because the component parts are increasing. In terms of the US administration's prioritization of China, I think there is obviously a lot of division within the US administration in terms of you have the Elbridge-Colbys, the idea that China is much more important than North Korea on all accounts, and we need to focus on deterring China on all accounts. We have the more economic focus, groups focusing purely economically on China. My concern is that the North Korea issue and the Korean Peninsula issue becomes sidelined. I think, yes, okay, we can make the argument that deterrence holds, and because deterrence holds, let's just leave North Korea alone, and it will just keep going, and the status quo will hold. It might test a few new missiles, get a few new systems, but we can just let it continue. This isn't very good news for South Korea. I mean, even under the Biden administration, there was a lot of feeling in South Korea that the Biden administration, in the early stages, wasn't placing enough focus on North Korea. Okay, and the immediate threat to South Korea is from the north, right? The challenge with respect to China, I think, which will affect the US and ROK alliance, one of the challenges pertains to these contingency scenarios. We can all imagine a nightmare situation of a Korean Peninsula contingency, but obviously there's another contingency, which is a Taiwan contingency. And I do think we should keep calling it a contingency because we don't know what it will involve. Okay, we've got the dates of 2027, 2035, right? The readiness dates from the PLA. And in the event of a Taiwan contingency, if we add strategic flexibility of the US forces Korea to that, what can we envisage? Well, here's one hypothetical situation. The possible redeployment of some, not all, some of the USFK to assist in the Taiwan contingency. Okay. Then what does North Korea do? North Korea sees that there's some kind of power vacuum in Seoul, or security vacuum, and it provokes Seoul. This is something that is just, I mean, you might say it's quite an extreme situation, and obviously it depends on the fact that the US does want to get involved, okay? But this is a concern. Related to this concern is how the US and South Korea envisage their commitment to the East Asian region. So you have Trump, or the Trump administration, talking about strategic flexibility. Okay, the USFK should serve a more regional role and not just a Korean Peninsula localized role. But then you have the Lee Jae-myung administration, and you have Lee Jae-myung on his flight to Washington on the 24th or 25th of August 2025, saying, we're not ready for this strategic flexibility. So on the one hand, you have the logic of the US wanting to get more involved in the East Asian region, which seems paradoxical to all of these claims that the US wants to disengage, right? If it's all about targeting China, that necessitates a broader involvement. But then on the other hand, you have the South Korean government saying, well, actually, not quite. We're not ready to play this broader regional role. that could be a source of tension.
I want to get to what sort of things the U.S. forces, Korea, and other actors can do to ensure that there is coordination on a Taiwan contingency and other issues across the Indo-Pacific. But you did mention the Trump-Lee summit that occurred in late August. President Trump repeatedly expressed an interest in re-engaging North Korea in dialogue. President Lee was similarly sanguine about the possibility. Kim himself now has said that he might swipe right on this request, if denuclearization is off the table, of course. So how should policymakers balance the utility of engagement with the goal of denuclearization?
So if I might use some alliteration, denuclearization plus dialogue, we've often talked about this idea of sanctions plus dialogue as an ideal combination of dealing with North Korea. I'm going to say something that you might think is slightly paradoxical, but I'll explain it. I do think that even though North Korea's intention to denuclearize is at its lowest point, in fact, it has no intention of denuclearizing. Denuclearization for Pyongyang is off the table. I do not think that the US or South Korea should drop denuclearization or CVID as a demand. Now why have I said this? Because we could plausibly suggest that if denuclearization is off the table, let's just move to arms control, let's try and do a JCPOA style deal, albeit with fewer actors. If as soon as the demand for denuclearization is dropped, this is going to be exploited by North Korea. We saw in the Singapore summit in 2018 how North Korea subsequently exploited this whole idea of denuclearization of the Korean peninsula versus denuclearization of North Korea. So at the moment we're in a real quagmire because, as I've said, North Korea doesn't want to engage in denuclearization talks, but its intention to engage in any talks with the US or with South Korea has plummeted over the last few years. I think 3 or 4 years ago it was at least pretending to engage in talks. Now it's not doing any of that at all. And let me just highlight a couple of cases here. We've seen Kim Jong-un's recent statement about he might be open to talk. I said might be open to talks, so long as denuclearization is not on the agenda. Okay, but let's just imagine hypothetically that Trump and Kim meet. They both benefit from the optics, right? Kim likes the optics. He wants to be seen as a nuclear equal. But let's just imagine denuclearization is not on the agenda. The North Koreans, at least in my reading, can view any non-nuclear talking point. If it's seen as a stepping stone towards talking about the nuclear issue, then they will disengage. The second point, though, pertains to South Korea. We've seen Kim Yo-jong, who Sung-Yoon Lee, Lee Sung-Yoon calls, the scholar calls the world's first nuclear despotess, and I like that description. She said very clearly in early August, or I think at the end of August, that Lee Jae-myung's appeasement initiatives, she said, would not be received or responded to by South Korea. In short, South Korea could not care less, about the government in power in Seoul in its what she called appeasement offensives, right? And actually, that South Korea will continue to view that North Korea will continue to view the South as a hostile power, the most hostile state, right? This is in line with the abandonment of peaceful reunification that we saw in January last year. So denuclearization off the table for North Korea, but I think it should still be pursued. In terms of engagement, now if Trump and Kim were to meet again, now you might think, well, what are they going to talk about, right? Is this going to be a sort of Rex Tillerson moment, when Rex Tillerson, when he was Secretary of State, said, well, we'll just meet with the North Koreans, we can just talk about the weather, if you want, right? I think people, I found that quite amusing. Part of me thinks that Trump and Kim might still want to meet. Kim might meet Trump. As I've said, he'll benefit from the status value of it. But he's now got Russia on his side, so he doesn't really need any tangible benefits from the US for now, okay? And in that same speech to the Supreme People's Assembly that you mentioned, Arias, when he said that denuclearization is off, we'll talk to the US if denuclearization is off the table, he said sanctions relief, we've never called for sanctions relief in a million years. I mean, you know, I'll believe it when I see it, right? But at the moment, I think this is the real dilemma. I know this is a politician's answer to your question, because how do we balance denuclearization versus engagement? It takes two to tango. We're at a stage now where North Korea does not want to engage in talks with South Korea or the US, unless it's on its own terms which are unacceptable for the US. Okay, and I think that's a deliberate strategy.
Now, these panels are always more interesting if the people on stage disagree. So for the sake of argument, before we turn over to Q&A, I wanted to challenge you on something you said earlier about this ideological cohesion, or let's say unity, or sort of shared purpose. There was a foreign affairs piece that came out very shortly after the Chinese military parade on September 3rd. Many of us saw those really iconic photos of Kim and Xi and Putin walking together to the parade. And of course, I'm blanking on the authors right when I need to recall them the most. But I really felt that their argument was rather persuasive, that an authoritarian bloc such as that is always going to be far weaker than a Western democratic, more transparent institution. This is what history says. And specifically, the North Korea, Russia, China cooperation, we have decades of precedent to suggest that actually whatever they're saying, whatever the optics are, the actual ideological coalition is far weaker than what we might actually think. So, if I was to push back on that, what are some qualitative changes that you see now in the current alignment that perhaps make it more durable and more sustainable than similar coalitions that we might have seen during the Cold War?
So the first point to realize is that if you're Kim Jong-un, you're doing exactly what his grandfather did. You're playing off Russia and China in order to reap the most benefit. Okay? What's different is you have the interconnectedness of the global order, okay, particularly between the West and China. But what are the qualitative changes that I see? I think at the moment, if we take what is often called the CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, the fundamentally important relations between these countries are bilateral. So at the September the 3rd parade, okay, we saw Putin in the middle, flanked by Xi Jinping in the middle, flanked by Kim and Putin. But what we also saw were bilateral meetings, right? Kim and Xi, Kim and Putin. We did not see a trilateral meeting, at least what was demonstrated in public between all three leaders. So that is very significant. I think when we're looking at whether this is an ideological component, I think there needs to be a caveat here. I think the first thing to highlight is that China's ideology is not identical to Russia's ideology, which is not identical to Iran's ideology, right? It's really as a theocracy, nor is it identical to North Korea's ideology. But the fact that these four states are united, I mean, I think Iran is the weakest link here, but let's just take this forward. The fact that these four states are united by what they're opposed is actually means that we cannot dismiss this as no big deal. And we should not dismiss this as no big deal. The fact that they are not in a formalized alliance also means that each state has the leverage to call upon the other to help each other out if and when they want to, if it fulfills this broader aim of delegitimizing the West. So I'll give you one example here. Following the Israeli bombings of Iran, of the nuclear, and the US bombing, of the Iranian nuclear sites, who helped Iran? Not China didn't, Russia didn't, and North Korea didn't. Okay? And we can take from that the fact that neither one of these four states wants to lead an alliance or to be seen to lead a formalized alliance bound by institutionalized structures. But in my view, this is why we should take them even more seriously. Because actually, we don't really know in the future how these bilateral ties are going to evolve. Because one, as I've said, they're asymmetric in terms of what each side gives and what each side gets. But secondly, I think they're fundamentally driven first and foremost by interests, but then also by values. So if each side can benefit from cooperating with another side, Iran and Russia in terms of Shahed drones, but then Russia now has the capability to make these drones indigenously, so it doesn't need to rely on Iran as much. Okay? But there might come a time when it does. So I think that this authoritarian axis, yes, of course it's not as strong as a formalized democratic alliance. I also think that this makes it very challenging, this loose ideological grouping, because I think it's for the longer term. I don't think this is a short-term marriage of convenience. You know, marriages of convenience in real life can go on forever, right? And this is a longer-term transaction. This makes it difficult for the US and South Korea, because actually, if you say, what can South Korea do to address the cooperation between Russia, North Korea, and China, right? What can it do? Because China is enabling Russia's war. China is allowing Russian vessels supplying weapons from Moscow to Pyongyang to moor at Chinese ports. China is continuing to help North Korea evade sanctions. So I don't buy the argument that China is angry. I really do not, with Russia and North Korea cooperation. It may be nervous, it might feel slightly emetic, okay, but it's not angry. What does this mean for the US and South Korea? Well, it means that actually the US and South Korea has to try and tackle these individual bilateral relationships at an even more individual level and look at, well, what can the US and South Korea do that China can't or that Russia can't? How do they tackle the North Korea problem? Yeah? If North Korea always wants to gain recognition from the US, could the US use China and go through China? You know, this is why the parade on September the 3rd was a lot of leverage, gave Xi Jinping a lot of leverage, because he can say to the US, well, actually, I can get through to North Korea, you can also get through to North Korea, but actually I've got greater proximity at the moment.
I've got a ton of questions that I had sent to you as well that I've written down here, but I wanted to give the audience a chance to ask theirs first. So for those of you in the room, please go ahead and introduce yourself and your affiliation. For those online, please use the live chat box. Same thing, if you don't mind introducing yourself and before asking your question. I saw a hand over here.
Good morning. Thank you for the informative talk. It was pretty awesome to kind of see it from a macro view. My name's Jordan Miranda. I'm an AU student. I'm taking a master's degree in U.S. foreign policy and national security. So this talk is very related to my field of research. And I wanted to ask, broadly speaking, what lessons can South Korea and the U.S. draw from what's happening in the Middle East with how we and Israel engage Iran to that of North Korea? I do know that the obvious difference is the fact that North Korea does have a nuclear arsenal. But in y'all's opinion, is the diplomacy that Trump undertaking in Iran entrenching North Korea's status with what it's doing in every sense of the word? Thank you.
So I think if we look at the US's bombings of the 3 nuclear facilities, okay, based on the information that we know at the moment, how did North Korea respond, or what lesson would North Korea take from that? There's one obvious lesson, which is that, okay, well, we need nuclear weapons. Okay, you know, we're going to keep developing them. But I think that ignores history. I think North Korea realized this actually in 1991 with Operation Desert Storm, which it watched very, very carefully, with the fall of regimes around the world, Noriega, for instance, right? After Desert Storm, you obviously had the fall of Iraq under Saddam. That was a pivotal moment for North Korea to realize that actually we need nuclear weapons. Okay, nuclear weapons are a no-brainer. And then you have the fall of Gaddafi. Again, North Korea. So I think actually the US bombings of Iran, it didn't just flick a switch in North Korea. It was just a sort of confirmation on the part of North Korea that what it was doing was right. In terms of Well, on the other hand, you realise that actually, well, if you think that the second Trump administration is purely isolationist, well, then you look at this. You look at these bombings, and I think for North Korea, it gives them momentum to say, well, they're going to develop their nuclear programs even more, okay? Because actually, who knows? The US could, okay? This is very hypothetical. Engage in some kind of action. Okay, if the US wants to do something, if it's determined to do something, it could still follow through. I think with respect to the negotiations with the Middle East, if we go back to the JCPOA, which both the US and then the Iranians pulled out from, I think North Korea is taking a clear lesson from this, which is that actually the US can't be trusted. This is not a new thing. I think that what we're seeing, if you're North Korea, you're looking at the US and saying, well, actually, this is just a continuation. It just reaffirms North Korea's long-standing logic that the US cannot be trusted. I can take a couple of questions.
Oh, sure,
It's
yeah.
actually easier.
Sure, we'll stack 2 or 3.
Well, Scott Snyder, president of KEI. Edward, thank you very much for your deep analysis of the relationship between North Korea and Russia, and your description of the two countries as kind of edging toward alliance. You mentioned a Taiwan contingency, and here in Washington, a lot of people are focused on that contingency. But I'm wondering, I haven't seen too much analysis of a Taiwan contingency that actually takes into account the possible impact of a North Korea-Russia alliance relationship. And so I'm wondering, in that hypothetical event, is that relationship between North Korea and Russia more likely to be a source of restraint on North Korea getting involved, or will it be a source of potential horizontal escalation, broadly speaking? And I recognize that that's a very hypothetical question and a broad question, but I'd be interested in your instinct on that at least.
Terrence?
Good morning. My name is Terrence Matsuo. I'm a non-resident fellow here at KEI. Thank you for this event. It's been very enlightening. My question is kind of on the South Korea point. You've kind of mentioned this in your remarks that Lee Jae-myung kind of said that South Korea is not ready for the U.S. to be a little bit more active in Northeast Asia, and he also said during the campaign, I think, right, that Russia is a neighbor that we have to have good relations with and things like that. And so my question is, kind of under what conditions should we expect either the Lee administration or South Korean progressives or even South Korean society in general to kind of take a harder line against Russia? Because I think it's always been there with North Korea because of the obvious threat, and we have seen South Korean attitudes kind of change on China. And so now my question is basically, well, what about Russia now? Thank you.
2 softball questions for you.
I'll take Scott's question first. Thank you very much. My honest answer is we need to consider where China positions itself in all of this. I think we sort of know where Russia and China's red lines are very, very broadly defined, which is that any conflict on the Korean Peninsula is going to be a total nightmare, particularly for China. Okay. In the event of a Taiwan contingency, if a Taiwan contingency were to lead to some kind of North Korean provocation towards the south, what would North Korea do and what would it use? If the Russia-North Korea military security cooperation continues and Pyongyang is actually gaining, whether it's conventional weaponry, weaponry to develop short-range ballistic missile capability from Russia, all of this will all play into North Korea's hands when it wants to exploit a South Korean security vacuum. And obviously one such vacuum could be a Taiwan contingency with USFK forces being removed from Seoul to help in the case of Taiwan. But the reason I say this depends a lot on China is because China and North Korea also have a mutual defense treaty. When Russia signed the treaty with North Korea last year, North Korea didn't just have a mutual defense treaty with China. It had, the one with the Soviet Union elapsed in 1996. It had one with Russia now, with two countries, right? And China has always been very wary, well, up to this point, it's been very wary of saying anything about the North Korea-Russia dyad. Because in my view, I think on the one hand, there's a sort of good cop, bad cop. China actually cares more about its status than Russia or North Korea does. So, the US and South Korea can name and shame Russia and North Korea and they won't care, but China will care. But also on the other hand, that if China were to try and put an end to this, if North Korea were to call on China to assist Pyongyang in the event of any conflict on the Korean Peninsula, then China would be obligated to do so if we look at this treaty. So in the Taiwan contingency, I can see Russia helping North Korea to support a possible situation on the Korean Peninsula, some kind of contingency on the Korean Peninsula, which will make things very difficult for the US-ROK alliance. And I think what unites particularly China and North Korea is to see this US-ROK alliance fraying. Perhaps not being completely destroyed, but fraying. On Terence's question on China, what conditions can we expect Lee Jae-myung to take on Russia, to take a harder line against Russia? So when Russia invaded Ukraine, that was the final few months of the Moon Jae-in presidency. Then Yoon Suk-yeol took over, and the Yoon administration kept using this rhetoric of red lines. Kept saying, look, if the relationship between Russia and North Korea crosses more and more and more red lines, we will seriously consider escalating our response. Okay. And within that, people thought, would South Korea ever supply lethal assistance to Ukraine directly? The South Koreans have kept saying this idea of red lines. If things get worse, they'll take an next step. And by the end of the Yoon administration, this never happened. I think as part of Lee Jae-myung's pragmatic diplomacy, whatever that means, I think we don't know what this means at the moment. We've seen numerous pronouncements from the Lee Jae-myung government trying to explain what this means. I think there's still a long way to go in terms of actual clarity. I also think there's no bipartisan consensus in South Korea, as to what pragmatic diplomacy means, or what it means to be pragmatic in the foreign policy domain. I think we're going to see the Lee Jae-myung government actually adopt what Yoon Suk-yeol said in his 2-year press conference, which is South Korea will look at its relations with Russia on a case-by-case basis. Unfortunately, I don't see a situation in which this current South Korean government would supply lethal assistance to Ukraine directly. Doing it via Poland, via a third party, seems to fit its current narrative. And I think, Lee Jae-myung has said that there's no need to he accused Yoon of antagonizing Russia and China. So I think there's going to be a bit more caution in this relationship as well.
Yes.
Hi, we have an online question from Andy Hong at NYU Law. He says, thank you for the informative event. We have seen European governments announce Indo-Pacific strategies, and they obviously have a keen interest in a Russia strategy. Have we seen tangible moves to link the two, or do they remain separate policy approaches? On that note, what role does a transatlantic relationship or Korea-NATO relationship have?
Do we have another question we want to stack with? No? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for the online question, for mentioning Europe. I think I cannot give this talk without talking about Europe or the United Kingdom. The reason I say this, in all seriousness, is because whether it's the Yoon administration or the Lee Jae-myung administration, South Korea really cannot avoid the fact that, yes, it is trapped between great powers, but it's also got global ambitions, right? Whether as a global pivotal state, to use the Yoon administration's rhetoric, or whatever the Lee Jae-myung administration comes up with that's basically a synonym of this, okay? And engaging with Europe, I think, is very important here. Europe-South Korea relations have been going on for a long time, and I think cooperation, particularly in the cyber domain, in AI, in the digital domains, this is one way forward. And this is not out of line with what the current South Korean government has said. Lee Jae-myung has made clear that he wants South Korea to lead in AI, to lead in technology. Okay, this is also helps the U.S. South Korea relationship. I don't think South Korea should diversify at the risk of losing its US-ROK relationship. I think the US-ROK relationship is the foundation, it's the cornerstone, and then after that, the South Korean must also engage with like-minded partners in Europe and including the United Kingdom. Why do I mention the United Kingdom? Because the Royal Marines have taken part in South Korean military exercise involving South Korea and the US. This is some potential for future collaboration. We know that South Korea wants to develop its naval capabilities. Cooperation with the UK in this regard, is one possible area of cooperation. Why is all of this more important now, more so than ever? Because I could have said this 5 or 10 years ago. Because the Ukraine war has highlighted that the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theatres are intertwined. Now, whether I take the Japanese approach and say it's one theatre, or whether it's two theatres linked together in one, I mean, that's a whole other debate. But the Ukraine war has really confirmed this idea that these theatres are intertwined. What is solely a European issue is now no longer solely a European issue, right? The North Korean involvement as an active actor, not just a peripheral supporter of Russia's war against Ukraine, is one example here. So I do see potential for Indo-Pacific and Russia strategies to be aligned. The South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy released under Yoon Suk-yeol was quite light on China. It basically comprised a list of descriptions saying China is a very important economic partner which we need to develop, and that I can't remember the exact number, it's between 70 and 80% of South Korea's and Japan's crude oil flows through the South China Sea. So if there's a crisis in the South China Sea, then this is obviously not very good for South Korea and Japan. But I think the issue with Indo-Pacific strategies is that there does need to be some more coordination between these Western countries, particularly in terms of common threats. And this leads me to talk about NATO. The fact that the IPP4, the Indo-Pacific 4 countries, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, have been invited to the NATO summit for 4 consecutive years, is nothing to gloss over. It's a real example that actually not only does NATO benefit from cooperation with these countries individually, but also as a group, but these countries, particularly South Korea, benefits from stronger links in cooperating with NATO. This year was a slight aberration in that it was only the New Zealand Prime Minister who went, on the part of South Korea, and the National Security Advisor, Ri Sang-nak, went, but Lee Jae-myung did not. The same happened in the case of Japan and Australia. So South Korean NATO cooperation, in terms of governance, particularly in terms of normative governance, setting standards, setting norms of cooperation, but also highlighting this interconnectivity between Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theatres, is very important. And I think the Indo-Pacific states can learn a lot from NATO. Why? Because actually we have NATO member states that are being, most obvious example is the US, being engaged in minilateral forms of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, the quadrilateral dialogue, AUKUS, however that is going to go and pan out, that's very uncertain at the moment. And I think this is important for South Korea, because South Korea must also continue to engage with the Quad, with AUKUS, even if it's not a member. I don't think membership precludes engagement and cooperation. And if there's one piece of advice I would give the current South Korean government, it is to continue this. It's not to let partisan politics overshadow the importance of foreign policy decisions. It's very easy for a new government to say, well, the predecessor government engaged in the Camp David summit trilaterally with the US, Japan and South Korea. This was a very big success in my view. It engaged with the Quad, it engaged with AUKUS, but that was their government. We're going to do something different. Unfortunately, I think that's letting domestic politics cloud your foreign policy judgment at a time when regional and global order and great power politics is only continuing to intensify.
Online question.
Yes, we have an online question from Joseph Jung. Thank you for hosting the event. Due to North Korea's establishing close relations to Russia, what might be the biggest concerns for China's relations to North Korea and the relationship with Russia?
And I'm going to stack on to that one as well. So in your paper, you actually have specific policy prescriptions that the U.S. and South Korea can take to address some of these trends that we're talking about. So if you don't mind talking about some specific takes in both the short and the long term that you identified that Washington and Seoul can do.
Thank you. So I'll take the online question first. Can we pass China from Russia? And that's the sort of million-dollar question here. I mean, China is very important to Russia. It's very important to North Korea. This is why the Xi Jinping's hosting of Putin and Kim Jong-un, in my view, was so important and a big win for Xi. I still think China is not going to say very much about the Russia-North Korea cooperation. China could fear that if it were to say something to express frustration or anger at the Russia-North Korea rapprochement, that Moscow and Pyongyang will get even more closer together. But I also think that there's a good cop, bad cop mentality here, in the sense that China is happy continuing to support North Korea to help Pyongyang evade sanctions. It's happy to allow Russian weapons factories to operate within Chinese territory and to continue to enable Russia's war whilst not getting too involved. China does not want to cut off its economic ties with the West. I think that's quite clear. What does the Russia-North Korea rapprochement mean for China's ties with North Korea? Well, we're already starting to see Kim Jong-un play both sides off, right? You know, when North Korea-Russia ties first developed, I think this was so important for Kim Jong-un because North Korea was in dire straits. Its economy had plummeted, had sunk. During COVID, right? COVID was the best sanction on North Korea. It was self-imposed, right? The border closure for nearly 3 years. And then North Korea leapt in and seized the opportunity for its ties with Russia and to rekindle them. But does North Korea want to bin China, want to get rid of China? Of course not, because China has been far more important to North Korea over the last 20 years than Russia has. Okay? China has been North Korea's economic lifeline. And so for Kim Jong-un moving forward, I think he will look back at the September the 3rd meeting with Putin and Xi Jinping as a win. It's allowed him to make clear that actually he can diversify away from China but keep China on side as well. There was something else I was going to say on this, and I'll come back to this. In terms of the policy prescription in the short term, I mean, I'm going to be very pessimistic here. What can South Korea alone do about the North Korea-Russia cooperation? South Korea alone? Actually, my answer is very little, I think. And I don't want to say this, but I think it's important to be pessimistic when being pessimistic means being realistic. But there are two things I think that the U.S. South Korean alliance need to do. One is very short term, which is to have a clear delineation of expectations when it comes to OPCON transfer, when it comes to strategic flexibility. This needs to be done actually to be set in stone as best as it can pretty clearly. The reason I say this is because alliances have changed in how they operate. The post-war, Cold War, and the San Francisco system, the hub and spoke system, were set up within a very specific architecture, within the end of the Second World War, right? With the Marshall Plan. with reconstruction in East Asia. Okay, this is a very precise moment for setting up these alliances, when the US basically became and continues to hold the position of being a security guarantor. Now, in 2025, if we are in what many people have called a new Cold War, including the UK's own Defence Secretary, that's a whole other question I can answer if you'd like. I do think that part of these expectations of clarity in alliances pertains to, well, how much do people want to contribute? You know, I mean, Trump gives out random numbers, 10 billion, etc. But I think that the South Koreans in particular should be ready to contribute more to this alliance, because the broader change in the order, in the Cold War, in the order we're in at the moment, affects the US, affects South Korea, affects everyone. Okay. The second point in terms of clarity is with respect to dealing with North Korea specifically. When Trump met Lee Jae-myung on the 25th of August, I was surprised that the word denuclearization was only mentioned twice in the public summit. And on both occasions, it had nothing to do with North Korea. I think clarity with respect to denuclearization of North Korea is very, very important. After the summit, we've seen lots of statements from, say, Lee Jae-myung saying, well, we need to get China on board to help North Korea's denuclearization. This has been going on since the six-party talks, right? But there needs to be greater clarity with respect to denuclearizations. I think thirdly, upholding the current sanctions regime. The collapse of the panel of experts, we've seen the the generation of the MSMT, the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team. They released their report, their first report in June this year. It's not the same as the UN panel of experts. It hasn't got the UN stamp, whatever you may think that's worth. It's not strictly independent. But I think ensuring commitment to these three fronts and also to continuation of US ROK military exercises is very important here. Because, yes, there's been a lot of research that's been done that says actually, well, if US South Korea relations were bad before military exercises, they stayed bad after them. If they were good before, they didn't get any worse after them. But I don't think that's an argument for scrapping them all together. I think history is very important here. When Team Spirit was cancelled in 1992, or was it 1993, either one of those 2 years, I think it was 1992, did this affect North Korea's behaviour with respect to the non-proliferation regime? Of course it didn't. Okay, Pyongyang subsequently threatened to withdraw itself from the NPT, reneged on the agreed framework. It didn't work out. You know, they were cheating with highly enriched uranium, all the while plutonium was being frozen, and in January 2003 pulled out from the non-proliferation treaty entirely. So I think we do need to go back and look at the history of North Korea's strategic behaviour in informing current policy decisions.
And if you are interested in that history, Ed's book, once again, is North Korea and the Global Nuclear Order When Bad Behavior Pays, from Oxford University Press, 2023. A big round of applause for Dr. Edward Howell, who's flying back to the UK today, in fact.